Hey guys, this is Jeff Stanek with Figured Out Baseball. I've got a great Figured Out Baseball podcast for you today. We are very, very lucky to be joined on the podcast today by the New York Yankees pitching coach, Matt Blake. Very, very excited to get in touch with Matt. I was lucky to get in touch with him through a kind of a mutual connection, and I just think this is going to be a real treat for all of our subscribers and listeners. If you listen to Figured Out Baseball podcasts regularly on the website, know that you can also find our podcast now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more, as we try to put our content in more and more places, and always available for free to our subscribers. Today's podcast is brought to you by Crossover Symmetry. I'll give you a background on Coach Blake before we jump into questions with him. He is originally from Concord, New Hampshire. He played collegiately at Holy Cross, a Division I school in Massachusetts. After college, he spent about 7 years coaching high school baseball as an instructor at an indoor facility, as well as coaching travel teams. Also, in that period of time, he was the pitching coordinator at the Cressy Sports Performance in Hudson, Massachusetts, under the very well-known Eric Cressy, who also is now maybe coincidentally with the Yankees. In 2015, Coach Blake was hired as the pitching coach for the Yarmouth Dennis Red Sox in the Cape Cod League. December of the same year, December of 2015, he was hired to be the lower-level pitching coordinator in the Cleveland Indians organization, now the Cleveland Guardians. So that's where Matt got his start in pro ball. October 2016, the Indians promoted him to be the assistant director of player development. He remained in that position until November of 2019 when he was hired to be the pitching coach for the New York Yankees. So, Matt, I certainly appreciate being on the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to this one with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
So I typically like to start with something from the bio that stands out and something that I think is worth getting into and worth asking questions about. And I think what I'd like to ask first is just basically from being a coordinator to a pitching coach. I'd like to just ask you a little bit, Matt, about what the difference was there. I mean, I don't know. You don't get to spend as much time one-on-one with guys as a pitching coordinator when you were with the Indians organization, and then you were promoted to be the assistant director of player development. Again, not exactly working one-on-one every day with the same guys. You have your hands on a lot of guys, but not necessarily working with the same guys all the time. You didn't have any high-level pitching coach experience before joining the Yankees. Can you talk a little bit about maybe anything that was maybe some of the more difficult transitions for you, or things that you found a little bit challenging going from being a coordinator to being a pitching coach for one specific team instead of the whole organization?
Yeah, I think the natural thing is when you're the coordinator, you're really a coach of the coaches more than a coach of the players. That's how we tried to view it in Cleveland, where you're really in a supporting role to try and think in systems. So how do we get the most out of our players? Well, we do that by empowering our coaches, helping educate them, helping them bring them along, so that you're really focused on your relationship with the coach to impact the pool of players. Because the biggest problem is when super coordinators come in for 3 days to an affiliate and they jump in and start coaching all the players. It kind of impacts the relationship of the coach and the player. And then you leave and the coach is left with the player, and they've got to, bring the relationship back of, well, he said this or I said this, and you kind of get things tangled up. So we always try to keep it clean, and you're really there to help the coaches execute the plans for the players and provide support for them. And for me, it was, really trying to tie the front office and the analytics departments and, have the holistic perspective about the different domains, whether it's the strength conditioning or, the training staff, trying to make sure we have a clear picture at, what is holding this player back from being a major leaguer. And then obviously when you transition back into the coach side of it, it's really just the difference of the day-to-day grind that you're in, the emotional ups and downs of winning and losing on a nightly basis at the major league level. And, really that's the main reason why I wanted to get back into coaching, was just the connection to the player and the feeling that you're in the trenches with them and trying to develop something towards a championship. So you're a little bit more removed from in the coordinator role, and maybe a little bit more flexible lifestyle, a little more balance, a little bit more freedom in kind of where you go and how you operate, but maybe a little more detached from the end result.
But in a way, in a sense, Matt, you were by being a coordinator, you're coaching coaches, as you said, and preparing, helping coaches to get better at their craft. So in a way, you were, almost preparing yourself. I guess you could look at it that way.
Yeah.
By coaching the coaches, you were probably sort of laying a lot of the building blocks that you maybe use as a pitching coach as well. Is that
Totally.
fair to say?
Yeah. And I think, too, that just the entry point that I got into Cleveland was really helpful. It was kind of opportunistic in the sense that coming in as the lower-level coordinator with, like, the upper-level or main pitching coordinator, Ruben Niebla, who's now the pitching coach for the San Diego Padres, he had a lot of, like, institutional knowledge. He had coached, for 15 years at all the levels. He had been coordinating for, I want to say, 3 or 4 years at that point. So he had a really good understanding of, how the Cleveland, Guardians operated, what pitching coaches should be doing at the pro level, maybe what some of the natural tensions are of, the pitching coach and front office, pitching coach and coordinators. So he can kind of lay a lot of the, like, institutional knowledge down and show me some of the, like, the leadership components of that while I kind of got a, lay of the land of, what we were doing as an org. And I think more so my first year, almost like coming in as a consultant, where my skill set was really in, like, tying in the physical side with my time at, Cressy Performance, where, basically it was, the strength training and the skill side kind of merged together in a private facility. So I think that was kind of the value for me, getting in there and trying to help pull some of these holistic player plans together while not needing to necessarily lead the coaches or the players or the scheduling in the first year. And then, while you're doing that, you're kind of crowdsourcing, like when you go into these affiliates and these coaches have more experience than you coaching at these levels, like what are the best practices? What are they doing well that I would want to emulate if this was my turn? And I think one of the things I valued about Cleveland was that they gave the coaches time during the season. So if they had a graduation or a family party they had to get to, like they might take a 3-day break and then the coordinators would go in and, fill in for them. So I got some opportunities at AAA, AA, High A to go in and coach for 3 to 5 days at a time and, kind of keep your chops fresh there, if you will, and get the tension of being on the ground. What are the things that I would need differently, or how would I respond to things that are happening, as a coach? So I think just giving you a different perspective and hopefully preparing yourself for that opportunity if it comes.
Matt, what are some of the differences and even potentially some of the similarities between coaching pitchers at the levels that you had previously, particularly at high school age players, and jumping into coaching, established, for the most part, established major leaguers? And I'm asking this, Matt, because as I said before we started recording, I want these podcasts to be a good resource for guys that are coaching at all levels. And I think a lot of our subscribers, a lot of the listeners to our podcasts are involved at the high school level, although we have college coaches, I think, that listen to these. Maybe if it's pro coaches, we have guys that are involved in baseball as low levels as little league. So I guess what I'd like to, what I really want to ask with that question is, what does the job description look like for you as a major league pitching coach compared to what the job description might look like, when you're coaching 14, 15, 16-year-olds? Like, how much different is it for you at this level as far as, just what you're doing day to day and what your main responsibilities are as far as getting these guys ready to have success on the mound?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is just that there's so much more information at the major league level that you're trying to apply, and the players are so much closer to their, like, true potential. So you're not doing as much developing, and you're doing more like optimizing of the players you have. Because there's not as much long-range development to say, Corey Kluber, for example, like he kind of is who he is, and you're kind of tweaking some things where, you're 14, 15, 16, and even your, 18 to 21-year-olds, like they have a window of adaptation ahead of them that you're trying to push them towards and trying to figure out what the low-hanging fruit is for each player to maybe attack and get better at, whether it's getting stronger, moving better, fixing their delivery, teaching them different pitches. I think that the similarity in all of it is that, like, these are all humans trying to perform a difficult task, and I'd say for the most part, they all want to be coached. It's just a matter of, what type of coaching do they want and on what environment, what type of information can they handle. So you're always trying to meet the player where they're at. And your major league player may just be a little bit more advanced, more experienced, more things to draw from, where you might have less to draw from on your 14, 15-year-olds, but you also have more growth ahead. So it's maybe easier to push them in a productive direction.
One of the things that you experience with all the information that you have, I'm sure, is that basically every hitter that your pitchers are to face in a major league game, you have all the information you could possibly imagine, and you know exactly what their strengths and weaknesses are. At the high school level, not nearly as much information. A lot of times a high school coach, when calling a game, for example, doesn't know much about that hitter except maybe what he saw the previous year. Maybe you can find a little bit of perfect game video or PBR video online, something like that. But you don't have a whole lot of a scouting report. You're left with a lot more of like what your pitcher's strengths are and what he's capable of doing, as opposed to pitching maybe to hitters' weaknesses. Can I ask you, Matt, what percentage or ratio, I guess, again, if this is a fair question, your overall pitchers, are you primarily pitching toward a pitcher's strengths, pitching toward a hitter's weaknesses, a combination of both? And if it's a combination of both, which I'll assume that it is, can you talk about maybe like what degree do you go with either of those when setting up a plan, for a game against a particular lineup?
Yeah, I would say even at our level, it's largely trying to identify what your pitcher's strengths are and really honing in on those. And if, loosely, probably 80% strengths, 20%, opponent tendencies. And obviously, if you're facing, the premier players in the league, the Vladimir Guerreros, the Otanis, like there's probably some weighted, factor that's more than 20% when you're facing those guys, but you don't, I think, typically want to get too far away from what your pitchers do well. So I think we're constantly trying to put our pitchers in a position to succeed by telling them what their strengths are, getting them to buy into what their strengths are, and then going out and executing their strengths as consistently as possible, and then understanding where any of these nuanced, adjustments might come into play throughout the course of a game or a season. But I would say at most levels, identifying the strengths and really trying to attack those is probably the right path, and probably the easiest path, where I think you might set yourself up for a little bit of failure when you go the other direction, try and do things outside of the scope of what the pitcher does well.
That being said, how much time do your pitchers spend watching film? And I think this is something that is worth asking even for youth coaches that are listening to this, because now more than ever, there's film available in college baseball at a lot of different levels, especially at the Division I level with Synergy, that you can basically watch anything that any game, any hitter, any situation that you want really, really easily there. And I'm assuming at other levels of college baseball, you can find a decent amount of film on some guys as well once you get to that level. And again, even in high school, you might be able to see a little bit from time to time. But how much time, if any, do your actual pitchers spend watching film on the opposition? Or is it primarily up to the coaching staff to watch film and then sort of go to the pitchers with a plan of what, of how we're going to attack guys based on what you see? I'm curious if your pitchers like to watch film on hitters, and maybe that's different from guy to guy, but can you talk a little bit about that and about just kind of generally speaking what your guys like to do?
Yeah, you obviously have a wide range of behaviors there, where our most advanced, starters might spend more time over the course of the week of, obviously watching the games in front of them, trying to get a read on who the hitters are, but then spending time before their outings watching, I'd say anywhere from, 2 hours to 5 hours of video. I don't think many guys in the course of, their 5 days are watching much more than that. And I would say on average, it's probably an hour to 2 hours for a lot of our starters. Our relievers are probably picking and choosing some of the guys they're watching. And I think it's a tricky game to play when you're watching video too, because depending on, the quality of the videos you're watching, the recency bias you might get into of watching the last 10 at-bats, things like that, you might be picking up on something that's really, there's not much signal to, like you're walking yourself into a trap of, well, he did this well, so I can't pitch there. But I think it's something to take part in, and obviously identifying what the hitter's swing looks like and things that, maybe he does damage on or he creates swing and miss towards. But I think it's one piece of the puzzle, and obviously it can be misleading at times if used improperly.
That's kind of why I wanted to ask, because I think with video and then all of the other data metrics that is available now, analytics that's available to both hitters and pitchers, I think that most levels of baseball are still trying to figure out how to use that. In other words, how much time do you spend on that stuff? How valuable is it really compared to what preparation might have looked like 15 or 20 years ago, when obviously you could still find video for big leaguers, but you didn't necessarily have a lot of most of the analytics and data wasn't really available, and it really didn't start creeping into college until the last 5 or 10 years at most levels. And again, I think a lot of coaches and players are trying to figure out what the right balance is, how much to use all of that stuff. Again, whether it's video or whether it's Rapsodo or whatever it may be.
Yep.
What about on that sort of thing, on that side of things, Matt, with just pitch data, whether it be all the things that a Rapsodo or whatever you guys might use, all the data that might spit out. How much attention do you pay to those sort of numbers, or is it something that you look at every outing, every bullpen? Is it something that you only look at and really bring to the attention of a pitcher when things aren't going well? Like, hey, so-and-so slider wasn't that effective today. Like, let's go back and see what the problem was, or maybe they were just seeing it well today for whatever reason or whatever. Do you look I'm curious to see how someone at your level and the pitchers at your level use data, how often they look at it, or if you feel like oversaturation with data and analytics can actually be detrimental to your pitchers as far as just going out and trying to perform and having a feel for what's working that day and just kind of gutting out a performance, which is again what you might have heard from guys before data really started coming along. That was kind of the plan: see what's working today and go at it and kind of gut it out and try to have a feel for the game. So curious about how that works within the Yankees organization at this point.
Yeah, there's obviously a sweet spot for how much you want the players paying attention to it, because obviously, you can create paralysis by analysis and trying to understand every single piece of information and data point that's out there and the fluctuation that might happen across, a bullpen to a game across a couple months. But I do think we're very on top of it as an organization and as a coaching staff about who our players are and maybe what the best versions of our players look like. And that's something that we talk a lot about really from the beginning of spring training, that we're going to hold our players accountable to objective things that we know to be true about them when they're going well. And, for us at the major league level, we're solving for getting outs at the plate as efficiently as possible. So, what does that look like when you're creating the most amount of swing and miss or avoiding contact or throwing strikes, whatever the thing is that we want to put attention on. But I think then from there, just monitoring across, bullpens into game, live EPs into games, and then, outing to outing, like there's obviously more fluctuation for relievers, on a nightly basis with smaller sample sizes. But, for starters, you usually get a decent bulk of work, anywhere from 60 to 120 pitches, depending on, where you're at. I think those give you pretty good barometers of, what the pitcher had for stuff and maybe, what was going well or not going well. And I think for us, it gives us an opportunity to have conversations and give direct, tough feedback to players that's not personal or subjective or my opinion. And I think that's the important part of using the data, is that it centralizes the conversation, hopefully removes some of the ego or the personality out of the conversation, so you can make meaningful change with players and get buy-in around things that we've agreed upon to be important. And I think that's how we use it most.
I've got to imagine that sometimes the egos are not not easy to work with. And I don't even mean that in a bad way necessarily, but sometimes guys that pitch at this level, at the major league level, have had such success that I would imagine at sometimes they're not real receptive to wanting to change. Do you find that at your level, this probably is the same at a lot of different levels, for a high school kid who's been having success the same way? Like I'm sure there are some high school players that would be resistant to change if they've been continuing to have success. But at your level, Matt, do you wait for guys to sort of come to you and say, hey, this isn't feeling so good, or I don't like how this is going? Like, what do you think? Are you the one that's sort of starts that conversation? Do you wait for guys to come to you? Do you feel like is that an individual thing as well with guys? And does that change based on the amount of time they've been in the league and how much success they've had? I'm just and part of this question, Matt, is just to, again, sort of guide younger pitching coaches as far as how aggressive they should be when talking with their own guys, and sort of when to make changes, and how to have your pitchers be the most receptive if you have an idea that you think is really going to help them. And I think that obviously you're at a different level than most people listening to this, but I think it probably transcends to most levels of baseball when guys are going to be the most receptive to listen to someone talking about a change.
Yeah, I think it should be a two-way street. Like, there should be opportunities for the player to come to you with thoughts about things they need to work on, or things they want to change, or reasons they don't want to change. And there should be opportunities for the coach to do the same, and basically provide suggestions, or resist players wanting to make change on small samples of things going poorly or not feeling right. So it's definitely a two-way street. We talk a lot about partnering with our players, but I do think that's why it's important early on to maybe get on the same page with players about, who do they think they are right now? Who do they want to be? What's the gap between that? What are the things they need to improve? So if you're a sophomore in high school and you want to play Division I baseball, but you're throwing 75 miles an hour, you might say, okay, well, your average, Division I player throws 85. So if you want to be a Division I player, like, we've got to close that gap somehow. So even if you're throwing a ton of strikes right now and you're getting high school hitters out throwing 75, that's probably not going to be enough to get you to a Division I level. So we need to make some changes. It may not be right now, but if that's the goal you have, then we need to maybe think about your development path and things that are going to help you there. Now, at the major league level, you probably don't have those wide-ranging gaps, but it's more so getting them to understand that you're throwing this pitch too much, or in this area, or you're not shaping the ball the right way. When you're at your best, you're throwing this, and it looks like this, so you have to do this with your delivery, or there's a bunch of different conversations that may come up. But I think on the front end of the whole deal, when you try and figure out how to partner with a player, it's identifying what they think of themselves or what they think makes them a good player or is helping them have success. And then, maybe what are the things that they're open to, thinking about for change, or introducing new information to them. And then what environments is that in? Do players like being coached in front of other players? Do they want that environment to be, one-on-one? Do they like data? Do they like video? So I think it really is, I don't want to say it depends, but it's really understanding the players that you're dealing with, and maybe their appetite for change and their ability to understand the information. And then, what level of success are they currently having? And I think that definitely factors in.
What about for guys, Matt, who don't love data? I don't know if you have any of those guys or not, but guys that really don't like to look at analytics for whatever reason. Do you have those types of guys? And if so, how do you, as a coach, who I would imagine you still feel like you need to know the data, how do you go about talking to players about what the data shows without necessarily like shoving data down their throats, if you have guys that really don't love to look at that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'd say we've got a lot of guys that don't really want to think too much about it. And I think the way we get to that is we still have to get to a point where we agree what the best version of them looks like. And maybe, whether that's current or future, or historically what they've looked like at their best. I think there needs to be some level of objective piece of information. It might be one data point. It might be a delivery visual that we have for them that we think, gets to their best version. But then from there, it's just the trust that we'll monitor the data and we'll only bring things to you when we think it's important. And we're going to really have to boil this down to one data point or one piece of information. We can't overload these guys. And ultimately, you're trying to bring that back to some level of feel, or subjective quality that they can own in their throwing process or their delivery, that they can take and make decisions on the mound with. Because at the end of the day, like, when you bring analytics or data to the player, if they can't make sense of that and take it into actionable behaviors, it's not really benefiting them. So I do think that there's obviously a balance of, well, we can't just say, well, no data works. There needs to be some level of objective backing to our conversations. It just, we may not make that the feature of the conversation.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Crossover Symmetry. If you want to build cannon arms that stay in top condition all year, check out armcare.com. Developed by Crossover Symmetry, armcare.com measures players' arm strength and range of motion and delivers customized prep, strength, and recovery training based on each player's wellness scores, strength needs, throwing workloads, and fatigue. It gives you the tools to keep your players at their peak all season. So check out the team packages on armcare.com and gain a competitive advantage in player development. Your players will be healthier, throw harder, and win when it counts. Crossover Symmetry and armcare.com. Matt, with several of the things that we've talked about so far, I honestly wonder if your degree in psychology comes into play much. How much do you use that with coaching and just how you interact with guys, or even just how you pinpoint how each player wants to be interacted with and how they want to be coached? Like how much I know that a lot of guys that have coaching in their future, a lot of guys will major in something maybe along the lines of kinesiology or something like that. But to you, how much has your degree in psychology been beneficial for you, if at all, as is in your coaching profession?
Yeah, I think it's been really the backbone of kind of how I've approached players. I think there's a lot of things around just social dynamics and group settings and understanding how people operate, behaviors that happen that way, understanding individual personalities, understanding how to deliver feedback. Like all these things are, tied in to some psychological concepts, and the philosophy minor that I had probably ties into a lot of the finding logic and first principle thinking to help understand problems and get to solving problems for players, but then psychologically understanding, how to approach these players to get the most, benefit for them and, not get adverse reactions, things like that. So I do think that they all kind of weave in, and then, having spent so much time with Eric Cressy where that could have been, a net negative, not knowing the bodies, spending time to really understand kinesiology, anatomy, to make that less of a weakness and more of a strength. So, I think they all come into play in, certain aspects, but at the, backbone of it, certainly the psychology degree and, where my interests were in college have certainly helped.
So along the lines of turning more of a weakness into something that's more of a strength, and also you mentioned bullpens earlier, just with what you're doing with your major league guys in bullpens, Matt, that your pitchers are throwing either between outings or even in spring training, probably more between outings during the season. Are your pitchers working more on? Well, let me just ask you, what are their goals in bullpens, and what are guys typically working on in a major league bullpen? Because I think that bullpens are also a place that really they're not optimized at youth levels. Bullpens oftentimes are just like, hey, these pitches are scripted. We're just going to throw them with no real intent, and that's a time when guys could be getting a lot better, but maybe they're not. They're not really optimizing that. So can you tell me what a major league bullpen looks like, and if it's different for starters, relievers, if it's different for established guys as opposed to to a rookie who's still trying to kind of feel some things out? Can you just talk about a little bit about what goes on in bullpens and what some goals are for different guys down there?
Yeah, I'd say the majority of our starters that throw a consistent bullpen in between, and I would think that they've come to a certain script that they like to follow that emphasizes their strengths to make sure that they're calibrated between outings, executing certain pitches with certain shapes to certain areas, and making sure they touch all the pitches that they feel like they need to keep in rhythm between, their starts every 5-6 days at the major league level. And then there's probably a part at the back end of a bullpen, depending on how many bullets we want to, use that day, where they're probably trying to push on a skill they want to improve or add to their arsenal. And obviously, there could be anywhere from 10 fastballs in a bullpen to 35 to 40 pitches in a bullpen, where you're throwing everything and sequencing and talking about different plans that you maybe use for the upcoming opponent. So definitely a wide range, but I do think that our best starters, from what I've seen, they generally have a script for about the first 15 to 20 pitches that they really like to iron out, so that they know their delivery's in sync, they're calibrated, the shapes that they're trying to throw into the areas they're trying to throw, and then they'll move on from there.
How do you decide, Matt, how many pitches are thrown in a bullpen? And let me just sort of a part B to that question. Do starters always throw, does a particular starter always throw the same number of pitches every time that he's in a bullpen between starts, or does it vary week to week depending on how he's feeling, not only physically, but like how his pitches look? Like if his pitches are really crisp, is that going to be a shorter bullpen than if his pitches aren't so crisp? Just kind of curious about that too. Again, kind of just, trying to help pitching coaches at all levels to do a better job with bullpens between starts, or even for a reliever's bullpen, to try to sort of structure those. So I'm curious about how you structure, bullpens for guys for the Yankees.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, there's probably some level of flexibility for every bullpen, just because, if you threw 135 pitches on, say, Monday, and you normally throw your bullpen on day 2, it might be hard to recover. And we're not usually throwing our guys that many, but it's probably going to put you in a position where it's hard to throw a quality bullpen on day 2. So, like, if you're saying I always have to throw 35 pitches, you may not bounce back particularly well for that bullpen, and it might actually set you back for the next start. So I do think that there needs to be some level of flexibility based on, how you feel like you're recovering, when your next outing is. Now, if you're every 7 days in college or high school, like, there's definitely some level of recovery that can happen before you get on the mound. You might be day 3 or 4 in high school, maybe even day 5, depending on, if you play another position and you need more recovery. But I do think there's probably your A bullpen is set up to do this. If I feel good, I'm going to execute this. If I don't feel great, I'm going to maybe pull back on the volume or intensity a little bit and really only focus on this part of the bullpen. There might be a scenario where you push your bullpen back a day, and now that throws you out of your routine, and maybe you add volume because of that. So I do think just thinking through, like, if I, in an ideal world, feel completely recovered for my bullpen, I would execute this. Now, when I get to that day and I don't feel fully recovered, do I still want to execute that? And what's the cost from today on my next outing? And there's a lot of guys that'll just power right through it, throw their bullpen. They've got 35 pitches. They're going to throw it. They might pull down the intensity, and they just go on, and then they just work on the recovery for the next outing. And there's other guys that'll just skip the bullpen. So I think it's being smart about how your body's feeling and recovering, but with the caveat that it doesn't mean you're not working. So if you're not throwing a bullpen, there probably needs to be a lot of legwork done in your throwing programs and in your recovery work and your strength training to make up for the lack of either recovery for that bullpen or the lack of repetitions you got in that bullpen. So it's not a way to opt out because you don't feel good. It's a way to change the direction of your recovery plan to go, more towards, soft tissue recovery, getting the training, stimulus in outside of throwing. But yeah, I definitely think that there's flexibility is needed, especially as over the long course of the season, and different things will come in, whether it's weather, schedule changes, things like that, where if you're too rigid, it might set you back in trying to be consistent.
To stick with bullpens for a little bit longer, how do you grade a bullpen? How do you decide whether a bullpen was successful or not for your guys? Or even when your pitchers walk away, like, what are some things that need to happen for pitchers to feel good about the bullpen they just threw, or things that might happen where a pitcher walks away feeling a little bit discouraged, based on that? And I want to say this too, Matt, just because I want to help coaches out there to have the, maybe what might call a proper focus in a bullpen, and be the proper amount of focus in a bullpen. Again, where I think it's an area where in youth baseball, bullpens are often just sort of something where guys are going through the motions. But I'd like to know, just for you guys, what maybe some things you have in mind that make a bullpen successful after it's over.
Well, I definitely think it's important to set the expectations and the plan for the bullpen before the bullpen starts, so that you can effectively assess what happened in the bullpen. I think a big mistake that a lot of guys get into is they just hop up on the mound and then just throw 30 pitches, and then it kind of just unravels on them, and they're not really sure what they're working on, and they just keep throwing. And it's hard to say you got anything out of that other than, you stressed the body and got some reps in, but there wasn't a particular intention or focus for the bullpen. And I think that's an easy place to go, because it's just, it's mindless work, and you just got it in, and there may be no one watching you. But I think if you set the expectation for the bullpen, or what the intention or the focus or the goal is, I think that at least gives you a place to start the conversation when the bullpen's either going on or after, about what happened. And I think that's where the the adjustability is important because, the bullpen for Garrett Cole is going to look drastically different in expectations than the bullpen for your JV pitcher at the sophomore. So I think being clear about, meeting the player where they're at and what they're working on is important, where there might be some guys where you're just saying, I just want you to work on throwing 70% strikes over the big part of the plate. I don't care what pitches it is. I don't care what area it ends up in. I just want you to focus on throwing strikes today. There might be velocity bullpens where you're saying, I'm trying to get to a certain velocity. I don't care about the strikes. And then there might be certain pitch-specific bullpens and data-specific bullpens where we're trying to create certain shapes. So there's definitely a wide range of types of bullpens you can engage in, and I think it's just being clear what are we trying to accomplish by throwing these pitches, and then we can talk about what happened after.
Matt, I'm not sure if you can put yourself in these shoes or not, but if you were a high school pitching coach today, generally speaking, with the whole staff, the whole pitching staff, what would be some of your goals, some of the things that you would sort of tell your players are the most important things? And I bring this up just because of what you said about throwing percentage of strikes in a bullpen.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes youth coaches, and even down to the little league, middle school levels, are too focused on things maybe they shouldn't be focused on, not focused enough on the things they should be. What would some of your main focuses be for an entire pitching staff as a whole if you were a high school pitching coach today, if you can put yourself in those shoes?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is if we're trying to create a competitive team, trying to win, say a high school championship, we've got to get as many pitchers capable of throwing strikes as possible. So if you say have 15 to 18, players on your team, we've got to have, I would say, 8 to 12 of them that can pitch. That might sound like a big number for some high school teams, but I think when I was at Lincoln Studbury with Kirk Fredericks, that obviously it's nice to have your ace go and he's going to give you a productive outing and there's certain things you're focused on with him. But ultimately, the bulk of your season is probably going to depend on pitchers 7 through 12 or 6 through 12 and what they can give you in, filling games out, finishing lopsided games, giving you some innings here and there, and protecting your main guys from having to overthrow. So as just a team construction, not limiting your innings to only your best 3 or 4 pitchers, because then you don't create enough depth to have a deep run in a postseason setting, which I think is really important. And even at the major league level, we had issues, a couple years ago where we didn't create enough high leverage relievers, or guys that were comfortable pitching in high leverage to give us enough depth to get through a postseason run, where I think that was a focus for us, last year and going into this year. It's getting as many guys reps in situations so that they grow and develop, so you're getting more guys accustomed to pitching in meaningful situations. And then I think specifically targeting, do they have a primary pitch that they can throw for strikes at a, let's say 65% rate. You could argue if it's 60 or 70, but 65 is probably a decent number. Can you get a primary pitch 65% of the time? And then if you can do that, it doesn't have to be your fastball. It could be a changeup. It could be a breaking ball. It's something you can throw for strikes consistently. And then do you have something you can change speeds with, whether it's a changeup or a breaking ball, or if it's a fastball off of your primary pitch. So I think it's just thinking through getting as many guys as possible that are capable of throwing strikes, and then trying to identify what's the one low-hanging fruit for each guy of adding ability to throw strikes with a breaking ball might be key, or if you have 2 pitches, adding the changeup in your catch play. I think thinking logically about how do we add more depth and variety to our staff is really important.
That's really good stuff. I want to talk a little bit more about just developing pitchers. We've sort of gone back and forth on this topic a little bit, but about just data and analytics for pitchers. And one of the things I read about you was that one of your strengths as a minor league coordinator was being able to use data to actually help pitchers, which is something I touched on earlier. I think that there's a lot of data out there. I think there are a lot of people that run facilities that have indoor facilities, for example, where there are kids, 8 years old through 18 years old that are coming in there and training. And they might have a Rapsodo, they might have a TrackMan, they might have hit tracks for hitters or whatever it may be. But a lot of times I don't know if people know how to use that data to actually help someone. if that makes sense how I'm saying that. I think that,
Yeah.
even if guys can say, okay, so and so's spin rate on his fastball is this, and his spin rate and his spin axis on his curveball is this, and now what? What do you do with that at this point?
Yeah.
If you were to talk to, just say you were in a room of youth coaches who all had access to data and analytics, what would be one or two things, Matt, that you would suggest that at the youth level, thinking from high school level down, that would be their primary focus as far as, like, this piece of data can actually help you, and here's how I would use it if I were you, and maybe some other data you can sort of, you don't necessarily need at that level. Like, are there one or two things that you would point to that you think might be some sorts of data that you think can be useful at that level, and then coaches can use that data to actually help a guy get better in a game, to as you said a minute ago, just to get better at being a usable pitcher at the high school level?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different ways you can go with it, depending on the type of players you're working with, their level of understanding of the information. And I would think at the very least, you have a Rapsodo, TrackMan, radar gun, pocket radar, whatever it is, and create a baseline for guys on, say it's, their fastball velocity in, March is X, in April it's, X plus 1, in May it's, X plus 2. I think understanding just a baseline of who these guys are, and then, the more resources you have, like understanding the pitch profiles, like what shapes do they throw, like what kind of movement does the fastball have, what kind of movement does the curveball have, and just creating baselines on guys so you kind of understand how they're evolving, and is the velocity ticking up when we do something with the delivery? Is it going backward? Is the movement changing? And I wouldn't even necessarily say act on the information right away, just capture and then start to watch. And then you'll start to notice certain things that are happening amongst your player group is, hey, we've been long tossing a lot and giving them more recovery on their throwing in the infield, and the velocity's been, ticking up because we're not putting as much stress on him across all these different activities. Or as he's worked on his stride, his breaking ball's gotten better. Here's the objective information we can see. And then it's like, okay, how do I learn about that? Well, there's plenty of resources out there now online, and I would say, Driveline's a great place to start, looking through their blogs on just different information about objective data and using, pitch metrics, things like that. But I would say at the very least, try and create a baseline on who your guys are from a velocity standpoint, just so you understand what they have. And then if you can get to a movement standpoint, that'd be good. But I wouldn't try and coach too much on it initially. Just try and get a better understanding of who your players are.
Do you think that people that have access to data, coaches that have access to data, should do you think it's okay for guys to use that to sort of help them experiment with guys and get objective results? When I say that, for example, a pitcher's slider is not that sharp, so we're going to mess around with some other grips, and rather than just use the eye test, we're going to use Rapsodo to see which one produces the highest spin rate, the tightest spin, the most break. Is that something that you think that guys should be doing at the youth level, or do you think that's a little bit of a misuse of those types of tools?
I think it's probably in the direction of productive behavior. I think it's being mindful of some of the limitations of the tools you're using, where for a while we were using Rapsodo pretty consistently across bullpens, and we would always come to this issue of, is the data accurate to what we're seeing in the bullpen? And if it's not completely accurate, what's our comfortability of coaching to the data? And it's a problem we've wrestled with quite a bit, just in terms of, well, would you rather have a coach just use his eyes and guess, or would you rather have him use some of the data and then try and be understanding that there might be some limitations, and you got to start to understand what those limitations might be in terms of, the consistency of the tool, and if you're setting it up properly every time and in the same place every time. I think that there's definitely some pitfalls to using technology that you have to be aware of. But anytime you can find a consistent objective metric to lean on, whether it's velocity or spin rate or some type of calibrated movement, I think those are productive things to test and retest in bullpens. It's just, not letting it be the end all be all. If you think you're seeing positive results in a bullpen, it's not necessarily registering on the tool, but it is leading to productive outcomes in a competitive setting. I think there are areas where you might override what you're seeing objectively. It's just, you have to kind of know the rules and, before you start breaking the rules.
Can you expand a little more on that, just about what you mean when the data might not match what you're seeing as a coach, and when sometimes might be where you might rely more on what you're seeing what you're seeing with your eyes as opposed to what you're seeing with the data?
Yep. And I think with, some of the tools, people have out there now and access to Rapsodo, it's just the way they track the ball through the imaging and the optical, measurement, you're not necessarily going to capture the movement exactly right every time, especially when there's a lot of gyro involved in the pitch. It just has a hard time processing what the movement's doing, where if you're using TrackMan's not actually necessarily visualizing, or in the old model is visualizing the pitch. It's just literally tracking the ball and its movement. So your movement might be better, but your understanding of the spin efficiency may not be as good, where you'll get a pretty good understanding of the spin efficiency of the ball on the Rapsodo, but the actual movement might be inaccurate. So that's where I think it's trying to be understanding of what are the tools we're using, what are some of their limitations and how they're tracking. How do we work around that if we add a high-speed camera to visualize things and then compare against, there's other ways around it. They just become more expensive and, have more time to, process data and information and visuals. So understanding the resources you have and the support you have is definitely important before you engage on this path.
Do you think, Matt, that to coach high school baseball today, that you need to find a way in your budget to get some of these tools that can measure objectively what's happening with guys? Or do you think that it's still possible to be a good pitching coach today without having a Rapsodo or TrackMan at your disposal? Because they're expensive, and a lot of high school programs, they can't. Probably a lot of high school programs out there that can't afford one. Do you think that that's something that coaches should really strive for and find a way to get it done, or do you think that it's still possible to do their jobs without them?
Well, I definitely think it's still possible to do your job without it. There's still a lot of truisms of the game that you can build at the foundational level of, youth baseball, high school baseball, and even into college baseball that don't rely on understanding, the data that you're in terms of pitch movement and tracking that we require, a $5,000 Rapsodo or a $30,000 TrackMan. So you can definitely improve players without having those tools. Now, do the tools sharpen your ability to improve the players, assuming you know what to do with them? Yeah, I think so. But there are a lot of things that you can get players better at that you might involve a stopwatch or a pocket radar, things along those lines that you can make a lot of headway just having good practice habits, building a good foundation of a throwing program that you don't need to know someone's spin rate. Now, if you were to optimize their pitch mix and their arsenal and their usage, yeah, there might be some things that you need to acquire to do that on a high level, but I don't think in order to win a high school state championship, you need to necessarily know someone's spin rate. I think that there are a lot of things you can do better by running an effective practice efficiently and putting good habits in and all those things that would build a foundational baseball player that can execute in competitive situations.
Matt, before we run out of time on this podcast, I would love to ask you and have a conversation about your job path.
Yep.
I think that there are a lot of people out there who they look at what you've done and think man, how great would that be? Or I think I could do something like that, but don't know where to start. Maybe it doesn't end up as a major league pitching coach, but I think there are a lot of guys out there that work at facilities or that are coaching high school baseball that are pretty advanced at what they do, and they would love to get to a higher level, whatever that means for them. But that the path of how to do so is not always clear to people.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how it even got started for you? I mean, not that long ago you were in various positions, but you were working primarily with high school players. You were working the private sector in the baseball world, and then even from that jump to getting a job as a coordinator with the Indians, and then just a couple years later, you're a major league pitching coach. Can you talk to people just about that path? and about like some things that you did right, some things that you think
Mm-hmm.
that you did that got you noticed, that even got you the opportunities to get you started on this path, and in a way that if we could talk about it in a way that other people might try to emulate, or just know what some of the important things are that they need to do to put themselves in a position for someone to notice them. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So initially when I got started, it was right out of college, and I was working on a sales job, not thinking I was going to do baseball as a full-time thing, but I was, interested in, giving back to the community. I was living at home. My dad coached me, so we went out and coached a rec team together, and I thought that was fun and enjoyable, and we had success doing it. And then I, coached an all-star team that summer, and, some kids wanted some private lessons, and this is 2008, around there. So I started giving some, one-on-one lessons to 13 and 14-year-olds, and, one became two and two became four. And, while I was doing this, I think I was frustrated that, in my playing career, I never really had a true understanding of what like the high level delivery looked like. There just wasn't a lot of information out there that I thought was like true, like foundationally true. Like there was a lot of jargon and like old school fonts about like what pitching should look like. And you could look at the greats and, Roger Clemens, Nolan Ryan, Greg Maddux, and they all did similar things, but without using just like pitching jargon, how would you explain that? And I think I started going down a rabbit hole of trying to find like, foundational truths about like, why is that important? Like, why does that move make sense from a, a true like kinesiological standpoint, understanding the anatomy. And so that's where I started doing a lot of research, trying to find articles about, what high level throwers were doing, whether it was from ASMI or, reading Eric Cressy's blog. I kind of just started like searching around and trying to apply it and test it on players that in these 13, 14-year-old private pitching lesson environments. And so I think that was initially the way I kind of assessed what don't I know and maybe where do I go find it. And so just being curious and open-minded to some different thoughts and looking at different avenues was probably the starting point. And then I think it really, I got some momentum. I started doing, say like 30 lessons on Saturday and Sunday and making more money in those 2 days than it was in my sales job the other 5. So like something was like kind of off kilter a little bit. Like I needed to spend more time in this area and less in the, the printing sales area. And I just wasn't sure how to do it. But I kept kind of plugging along. I had a mutual acquaintance through Holy Cross that introduced me to Eric Cressy. So I reached out to him because I was interested in some of the things he was looking at from basically a physiological level, like understanding what throwers look like, what do they need to work on from a training standpoint to help them with their delivery. So I kind of was starting to explore that in our conversations about pairing the skill and the creating ability of being a better athlete. And while this was happening, I was trying to grow my network. So Eric Cressy introduced me to Kirk Fredericks to go coach at Lincoln Sudbury. Kirk Fredericks introduced me to Steve August to go coach the New England Roughnecks. Steve August introduced me to Matt Hyde to help out with the New York Yankees, as an associate scout. And all these things are, essentially for free. I've got to, butter my own bread. I've got to bring clients into Cressy's place to get, lessons in. Kirk's not paying me anything. I'm basically a $1,000 stipend. I think the first year I might even work for free. I'm working for free for Matt Hyde. Like knowing that I was 23, 24, 25, like I probably had a higher risk, that I could get to. Like I didn't necessarily need as much money at that time. So I could kind of like just get by and kind of build some headway. And I think not being scared of that was important because all my friends, were getting jobs at, IBM or financial companies and starting to make money. And I was kind of like, treading water, doing this kind of passion project that everybody was kind of questioning, like, what are you doing? When are you going to get a real job? And, I think the being true to like, this is giving me, excitement for what I'm doing. I have a direction forward. I didn't know what the market necessarily looked like. I didn't know if there was a college opportunity or a pro opportunity down the road because, the pro opportunities really hadn't come around yet. But I think the daily, getting up and, I wouldn't say grinding, but I was, putting in lessons, really, if you look at the way the calendar laid out, I was trying to make the most of every single day and either improving players or meeting new people. And so, we're coaching Lincoln Sudbury from, third Monday in March until probably the first week in June. I'm coaching the Roughnecks from the first week in June till September 1st. I'm running my lesson business from September till the third Monday in March. I'm scouting kind of around that. So I'm putting myself in all these areas to meet new people, learn new things, grow your network, get new opportunities. So, really trying to create like a bigger surface area to have luck happen. And while this is happening, Eric Cressy obviously has an outlet on his blog that has a lot of traffic, and I started writing content for him and sharing videos and, really pairing the technology that maybe hadn't quite been brought to the masses yet with, at the time it was RightView Pro. It was a software company that had the license to major league players to show in slow motion. So I think just trying to see where the market maybe hadn't moved yet and trying to be ahead of that while just working every day at it really drove that creative process for me and got a lot of exposure. Obviously I'd grown my network pretty considerably. We'd had some prospects develop. We started working with pro guys at Cressy. So all these things kind of snowballed together, but it really just started with being curious about learning more about like the truth of what good pitching looked like.
That's so interesting at the beginning. And you're not the first guy that I've talked to that I've sort of asked how they got the opportunities they did. And a lot of it just started with curiosity in one place or another and led to some other things. So when you got hired with the Indians, Matt, was that a job that you applied for just blindly? Was it a job that you knew somebody that kind of helped you to get an interview? Just kind of curious how you got your start there.
Yeah, so things had kind of snowballed for us between Cressy and I, and our exposure, and we were getting a lot of interest from college teams were starting to ask if I had of interest, and pro teams were starting to ask if I'd be interested in coaching a Gulf Coast League team, a short season team, and I built a pretty sizable business at Cressy at that point, and I was making pretty good money. I was working a lot of hours, and, I might have been doing, in the bulk of the season, 80 to 90 lessons a week, which, is a very physical toll on you, to do that. So I knew the shelf life wasn't forever in that space. But I had done some public speaking at the ABCA convention, at Pitchapalooza, which is a pitching convention in Nashville. So I started to get some exposure to other teams, and the Indians were kind of at the forefront of kind of like seeking out more progressive instructors and coaches through these different avenues that weren't just, he played pro ball so he can coach pro ball. They were looking into the college ranks. They were looking into the private sector. And so they reached out, and I had some just mutual contacts with some of their, front office members. And they originally offered an affiliate coaching position, which I was just trying to, this is probably the first junction where I was like trying to weigh like what path you want to go on. Do I want to stay in the private sector and keep doing this and grow the business and try and figure out a way to make this work in the long term? Do you want to get into pro ball and coach on that, daily grind, which is a different, animal altogether? And I wasn't quite ready to make the leap to be an affiliate coach. But then they had some movement around, and they actually had that lower level coordinator opening, which they came back to me that same off season and offered. And I think that met the threshold of, interesting work, interesting position, flexible lifestyle, could still live in Boston, keep the business going at that time. So there were a lot of, balances within that role that I think really helped me say, okay, I can take this step and not feel like I'm like overcommitting myself and going away from something that I really enjoy. Because, I was happy at the time, so I didn't want to screw that up. And so I think that was being very careful about making some of these decisions. And ultimately it was, I feel like the right one, because it, gave me a huge growth opportunity to learn a lot from, pro players, pro coaches, the front office in Cleveland, which is really highly regarded, and you get a lot of learning opportunities. So I really think things took off when I got involved with them.
And then you're the New York Yankees pitching coach. Even with that, I don't think most people can wrap their heads around a position like that, including myself. But Matt, is that something like when a New York Yankees pitching job comes open? are you sending your resume for that? Are you like having guys make calls for you, or are they coming to you because you're on their short list of guys to interview? Like how do you even how do you even get to that point where you're in contention for a job like that?
Well, it's just interesting because at that time there really hadn't been many major league pitching coaches that had come from other areas yet. Like Wes Johnson and Derek Johnson kind of broke into the major league circuit from like premier college positions, and Derek Johnson was a coordinator before that. But I think those two kind of stood out to me as like, there are opportunities growing. A lot of teams had started looking into the college sector. I felt like I had a unique value in terms of, maybe my skill set, my understanding of the office dynamics, the coordinator role, understanding what players were looking for, how to facilitate those conversations. And I had been talking with the front office in Cleveland about, if a role had come open at a major league level or a college level that I was interested in. I had interviewed in the past for the Duke position and the Wake Forest position, along the way, that I knew that I had still interest in getting on the field. But I just remember that day when we heard Larry Rothschild got fired by the Yankees, or they weren't renewing, that we went to lunch and came back, and Chris Antonetti, our president in Cleveland, called me into his office. And, I had a good relationship with Chris, but it's not often I get called into his office. So I was kind of like, oh, man, what did I do? And he just said, well, I just want to let you know that, Brian Cashman reached out and they're interested in interviewing for a role with their major league team. And I was like, really? I was like, just thinking about, New York and the expectations to win every year. And I would have thought they would have been pursuing a more like tried and true, like not a retread necessarily, but someone who had experience in the role that they could plug and play with given the roster that they had. And then I just wasn't sure, what the expectations were for interviewing me. If it was an info grab, a lot of teams will, try to interview employees to learn about, what people are doing. And so I got a chance to basically call Brian Cashman before I accepted the interview, just to understand, like, okay, what are you guys looking for in this role? Why are you asking to interview me? Like, are you serious about, my skill set and background being the major league pitching coach, and what would that look like? And, the pushback from the media, the fans, the players, like, what does that all look like? And we walked through probably a 20-30 minute conversation about things that they were hoping to achieve by opening this role up and seeking out new skills and the types of people they were looking for. And they weren't sure if I was the right fit or not. Just that you didn't know what I was going to look like in a uniform. I had never coached really at the professional level, so but they were interested in the skill set that I might be able to provide. So I went and interviewed with the group, and I think at the time they were looking for someone to help bring information to the players, bring our players up to speed on what was available to them, the resources that were at hand that the Yankees had maybe developed but hadn't really fully utilized or pointed in the right direction yet. And so my role in Cleveland was like very well suited to help with this, assuming that I could get the buy-in from the players and get the trust from the players, and the game wasn't going to be too fast in the dugout. So all those things were a part of the conversation, and talking through Brian Cashman's vision for it, I felt like there was really strong alignment. I still wasn't sure that they were going to go in that direction, and ultimately they did, and here we are. But it was definitely another exciting time, but also a pivotal turning point too. And this is a conversation that I'll always remember with Chris Antonetti, where he walked through, like, they were putting the offer on the table and trying to think through, like, is this the path you really want to go on to be, a major league pitching coach in New York with the bright lights and the expectations and the different, lifestyle involved of this 200-day train, versus being in the front office and all the different paths that are open to you there. So it was a really good, exercise to walk through about, like, what do you really want to do with your life, and does this fit now? Would it fit better later? All these things were coming up, and he was very neutral in trying to help me understand the decision I was making, and trying to take away the shiny object of New York City and the New York Yankees, and really think about, like, what are the actual behaviors and activities you're going to engage in over a 365-day cycle in these different environments, and is that something you're more interested in? And if so, please go take that. But I also don't want to, like, push you into that because it's a shiny object. So it was a really interesting, 7 to 10 day window decision making. But in hindsight, I'm really glad I did it, because it was one that I felt like if I turned down, I would always be kicking myself for not pushing myself to take on this challenge, even if I fell on my face in the first couple of years.
There are so many things I'd like to ask you. Maybe I should have asked this question to lead off the podcast, and we could have spent the first 45 minutes talking about this.
That's all right.
But I just want to ask, to kind of wrap this up, because this is, again, I'm a lifelong baseball fan, lifelong Pirates fan, growing up around Pittsburgh. I've coached at the college level, but never anything like that. It's hard to even put myself in that position. Matt, opening day, your first season with the Yankees, like, what was it like for you just to step out into that dugout and coach your first major league game, especially your first game at Yankee Stadium that year? I know 2020 was a shortened season, so it was a little bit of a weird season anyway. But what was it? Can you just describe what the first moment was like for you to come out into that environment with that uniform on in that stadium? Just how can you put that into words, like what that was like for you?
Yeah, I think it was. So we opened. It was obviously the 2020 year when things kind of hit the fan and we were delayed and we got a late start. But we were the opening game in July against the Nationals, who I think at that point were coming off of having won the World Series, and it was going to be Garrett Cole versus Max Scherzer on opening night, and we were the only game playing. Now it was weird because there's no fans in the stands, but you do get this sense of like anticipation of like, wow, this is really happening, and putting on the uniform and like staring in the mirror, like being like these. I always joke, like the pinstripes have a lot of weight to them. Like it's a heavy uniform, just metaphorically and physically. So I think that it was standing behind Garrett Cole as he's getting warmed up to start the game, and we just signed him to this major deal, and Max Scherzer is warming up on the other side, and you can just feel like this is the pinnacle of baseball right here, even without the fans. So I think it was definitely an exciting time, and I don't think it really came to full fruition of like the magnitude of what we were doing until probably last year when we got to, for me, Fenway Park, Yankees versus Red Sox, and I grew up in New England, so on the other side of that rivalry, but in a place that I knew, so I've been there and I've experienced those games. But when you're on the field and taking a mound visit and then walking back to the dugout and like looking back into the crowd and being like, wow, you're really here, like this the magnitude of the amount of people watching and the energy in the crowd and the game is just, it was something to like really hold on to, and this is a really cool experience, and one that I wish a lot of people would be able to get, knowing that they've kind of gotten to a point in their career of something that they dreamed about when they were a kid and didn't know if it was ever realistic or possible, but just one day at a time chipped away at it.
It's a pretty incredible story. Matt, before we wrap it up, is there anything else that you would like to say, whether it's about your own experience, about youth baseball, anything that to kind of leave people with, anything maybe I didn't get to that you would like to say before we wrap this up?
Oh, this has been great. I had a lot of great questions and good conversation here. I think the biggest thing I would just say is like if I can make it to this role, like I wouldn't say anybody can do it, because I don't think that's fair to say or realistic to say, but I do think it shouldn't be off limits to anybody to think they can do this. And then it's just a matter of the work they're willing to put in. And one comment I would say is, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to reach out to new people. Like, put yourself out there, put your content out there. If you have, interesting thoughts about, pitches or deliveries or whatever your craft is, like, I would say, put it out there, get feedback on it, continue to grow your network. Like, that's really how I got here. It wasn't anything magical. There were no magical connections I started with. It was just more like, be a good person, root for other people to succeed, and hopefully you continue to grow and, opportunities present themselves.
This is Matt Blake, everybody. He's the pitching coach for the New York Yankees, who spent more time than maybe he and I both anticipated in this podcast, a little bit longer than we normally have. But honestly, that conversation we got into, Matt, with your path to get to where you are now, it's hard to kind of wrap that up with any less time than we did. So thank you so much for your time today. This has been Truly, truly enjoyable. Today's podcast is brought to you by Crossover Symmetry and armcare.com. Matt, one last time, thank you so much, and I hope this is not the last time we have you here. I hope we can get you back soon again for another podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.